All right, guys, so I'm out again, but lesson 22 wants to focus upon the different choices that policymakers have when it comes to fiscal policy and some of the pitfalls and issues with it. But let's get going. So we need to talk about two different types of fiscal policy and how fiscal policy is happening all the time, built into our system without politicians acting. But there's also fiscal policy that is reactionary, meaning it is happening in response to some sort of economic crisis. So the first type of fiscal policy would be automatic, meaning the fiscal policy lever is changing due to changes in the economy, and there's no action being taken today by government or politicians. So we see this most frequently in our tax and our transfer system. So in our tax system, because of the marginal progressive tax, as the more you make, the more you pay, right? So 10, I think it's 15 now, 25, right? Percentage. So as you make more money, you pay a higher percentage. And this acts like a brake on the economy, right? So that way, more of your money, as you become wealthier, you can have to pay the government larger proportions of your income. And so it pulls more money out of the system through that system. Our transfer payment system works the same way. As you reach a certain economic threshold, the transfer payments stop, right? You do not qualify for them. And conversely, when you lose your job, the transfer system already exists. So our transfer payment system is already in place when some sort of cyclical action happens, whether it's increased unemployment or what have you, right? Now, again, for the most part, none of these things are enacted today. They are built into the system as they exist and only hit when you need them. Now, discretionary fiscal policy is deliberate action by the government in the short term. So, examples of this may be government spending changes. So we'll talk about the Obama and Bush era TARP, the Toxic Asset Relief Program that bought up all the bad bonds and loans that the banks made during the 2009 recession, and the government bought them up and spent something like $1 trillion. Right. We could talk about government spending that Trump is pushing for right now on infrastructure, right? He's pushing for a bill that would dedicate another $1 trillion towards road, bridges, and all of that stuff. Now, the second thing is we can also change our tax law, but not necessarily in response to any sort of larger economic issue, right? So in 2017, the Republicans and President Trump passed a large tax overhaul, which simplified it, reduced the tax brackets, right? And now that is discretionary. Right? It changed the makeup of who was paying taxes and how much. But again, not in this case, it was not necessarily in response to any economic crisis, but it definitely changed what our tax system will look like and definitely encouraged consumption because more people had larger disposable incomes. And then entitlement reform or entitlements. So if in a period of economic growth or with the Republicans, the Republican line is that entitlement programs are ineffective and at times can be wasteful. And so a big Republican push has been to reform entitlements, mainly Social Security. There have been pushes to privatize Social Security. Privatize Social Security, meaning banks and lending institutions could help you create Social Security programs, removing that whole collective idea from the system. All right, so any changes in these is discretionary policy. So again, like I said in the last slide, all examples of some automatic and discretionary fund fiscal policy. All right, so automatic stabilizers are an interesting concept. So they are built into the system, again, kind of like the taxes and the transfer payments, where they're the safety net. Either a safety net to stop us from an inflationary spiral or a recessionary spiral. So in an economic expansion, the marginal tax rate system is a automatic stabilizer, right? Because it pulls money out of your bank account as you make more. The attempt is to slow or to stop inflation. And the same thing here, as their disposable incomes go up and their consumption goes up, you see they don't qualify for transfer payments anymore. Now in a recession, as people lose their jobs and they go from paying, let's say, a 35% income tax to they lose their job, they're no longer paying income tax, that number goes to 0%. So there is your safety net. So that allows for them to keep whatever disposable income, or I guess in this case it would be mainly based around autonomous consumption because they no longer have income. Well, their autonomous consumption no longer has to get smaller to pay taxes. It's going towards keeping food on the table and such. Transfer payments works the same way too, right? You're going to see enrollments and transfer payments go up during periods of recession because of elevated unemployment. Now, again, these are automatic. These are not anything that the government needs to institute or act on legislation because remember, politics takes forever. They can't even agree what pizza topping to get for lunch. All right, so now in the second half of this lesson, I want to take a look at the TINSTAAFL relationship when it comes into regarding fiscal policy. Because remember, there's no such thing as a free lunch. With every action we have, there is some consequence that we must be willing to either accept or to try to mitigate. So we looked at this slide in my first screencast for this unit, and we noticed all the possible issues that are relating to fiscal policy. And so I would like to go through relatively quickly on each of these issues and kind of flesh them out a little bit more. So fiscal policy can actually kind of change what our output looks like. So I guess the best graph to use to illustrate this would be our PPF, or PPC, right? So if we're looking at two goods, good X and good Y, you could say consumer or government goods, right? We took a look at how that mixture can change in an economy depending on your level of freedom. Well, and if we have a lot of fiscal policy actions going on, so that means increased government spending, well, that government spending is going to increase in terms of your portion of your real GDP, right? Because remember, all of these actions are to offset decreases somewhere else, right? So if real GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX, right, and we see a marked decrease in consumption, well, we want to make sure that this number doesn't drop too low, so the government will pick up the slack by increasing government spending. Well, over here with consumption going down, that's less consumer goods being produced and more public goods being produced over here, right? So it could actually move your economy's aggregate output down the curve and more towards a mixture of Y over a mixture of X, right? And so the economy starts to make different decisions about how it uses its resources depending on what the government does here, especially if we start throwing in subsidies to businesses. You saw this during Obama's years during the recession with green energy, Trump with ethanol and coal and steel, right? That's going to change what we use our resources for. Number two is the great debate that liberals and conservatives have about the size and scope of government. All right, so liberals look to things like the New Deal and the Great Society as examples of the appropriate level of government involvement in the economy, pushing now for college, healthcare, and the list goes on, right? And so as we use more of this fiscal policy, aka government spending, well, the size and scope of government increases, right? The New Deal brought along a lot of government programs, a lot of government subsidies, transfer payments, and you've never really gotten rid of them. The same thing with the Great Society. right? Obamacare, as much as the Republicans tried, could not be repealed, right? And so when you put these programs in response to a crisis, usually for political means, it's almost impossible to ever get them to go away. Now, on the other conservative side, the conservatives say these programs are failures and they aren't effective, they're cost inefficient, they don't help people move out of poverty, multiple reasons, right? But again, you cite what I was just saying about how because it's a political football and you don't want to be the guy that has to say, well, we're getting rid of Social Security and it's privatized, these programs never really go away. And so you see through fiscal policy this growth of government, right? And you can see the growth of government spending as a proportion of GDP increase pretty much consistently from 1950 onward. Now, there's other reasons beside these things, right? We had to win the Cold War, we had multiple wars, but a lot of it, the main driver of our government spending and our debt comes from our transfer payment programs. So what is often politically prudent conflicts with what is economically wise. So the best example of this would be our steel tariffs, right? Steel tariffs are almost universally poo-pooed as garbage. Tariffs increase prices, which decreases our consumption, which is going to have a net negative impact for actual people on the ground. But in the small communities in the 3 states that Trump won, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, they see steel tariffs as something that they were promised and that the political promise has been delivered, right? And so now if you are living in those steel towns, whether or not you actually see an impact or an increase in your wages or anything like that, you see, okay, these tariffs are going to help me get my job back like it's 1958 again, and everything's going to be great, right? So the political decision, right, that Trump is making here is very wise, but it's economically going to be macroeconomically detrimental. Now, Obama did the same thing, right? Pushing for universal health care with Obamacare, right? It was politically popular, but look at what's happened in terms of the negative impacts. You see premiums, skyrocketing. You know, the cost of health care is going up and up and up by like thousands of percent per year, right? Because the system that they implemented had a lot of issues with it and a lot of problems that weren't really fully fleshed out, but it was a political decision, not necessarily an economic decision. One other component is the fact that fiscal policy relies on the use of debts and deficits in order to work, right? So if we're trying to resolve a recession, well, we know that the expansionary policy that a recession would call for would be an increase in government spending at the same time that you cut taxes and increase transfer payments. Well, that's like me getting a 15% pay cut, but then going out and increasing my consumption by 30%. Well, what's that going to do? That's going to create a deficit in which then I have to borrow, which then cumulatively over time increases my debt, right? And so in expansionary periods, you're going to push closer to deficits and increase your debt, whereas in expansionary periods, where you don't need expansionary fiscal policy, where the economy is growing on its own, you're going to be able to decrease the government spending, perhaps increase taxes, and that's going to move us closer towards a surplus, right? And so we'll talk more about this later on the week, but the idea between debts and deficits and how fiscal policy contributes to that can be seen throughout throughout Obama, and now through Trump, right? The expansionary fiscal policy decisions that we're making in terms of government spending and cutting taxes, well, we're blowing out these deficits and blowing out these debts. And then finally, we want to talk about the crowding out effect. And so we're going to get a little new graph for you here. So we want to take a look at the loanable funds graph. So we're going to label this nominal interest rate, and we're going to do quantity of loans. So now the loanable funds will be demand and supply. So when the government borrows money, it borrows it from you and it borrows it from governments. So when the government is increasing government spending but decreasing taxes, this is going to represent an increase in government borrowing. So that is represented by an increase in the demand for loans. Well, now we know based on our micro skills that the price went from here to here because of that increase in demand. Well, the nominal interest rate is going to go up. Well, we know when the price of something goes up, what happens to you, the consumer's demand? Well, the demand is going to decrease. And so what happens is the crowding out effect is the government gobbles up all of the loanable funds, and the available funds that are left have an increased interest rate, which then discourages private investment. The money gets allocated to the government and not to investment. So what happens is, if this is not addressed through monetary policy or other offsetting means, fiscal policy can hurt long-run growth. Right? Because without investment, you don't have long-run growth, investment in resources, capital, labor, because you're not spending your money over here, you're spending money over here in the bond market or in the banking market, because you can get a better deal at the higher interest rate. Right? And so we'll address what this looks like a little more in detail later on in this unit and into next unit, but the basic idea is that government borrowing increases the interest rates, which discourages private investment.